Chapter 13. Loco in New Mexico. Take a step, pull yourself up. Take another step, pull yourself up. It was hard work climbing Hogback, yet it was a primary entertainment for the Amish youth. Hogback was a steep and rocky mountain which was flat on top and nearly a mile long and a mile high. The young people loved climbing it and often took a picnic lunch along to enjoy from the top. Today, the boys had brought a crowbar to loosen some of the rocks at the top and send them down the mountainside. It seemed to be a harmless sport and great fun. Maudie carried a small basket of sandwiches, plates, and glasses, and Ida, the girl Jake had his eye on, carried another one filled with pickled beets, cucumbers, and oranges. Jake carried a jug of cold tea, and Maudie knew that his load was the heaviest. When they reached the top at last, a strong wind was blowing and made it difficult to lay out their dinner. But it did not dampen their spirits. They could see way over the countryside, over the ripened fields of oats and pinto beans hanging luxuriously full, over the wide, wide prairie to the distant purple Rocky Mountains. And then they could see down, down, down to the prairie floor below, where a few cows grazed. It was beautiful. Maudie peeled her orange and savored its tangy flavor. She listened to the young people talking and laughing around her, and sometimes joined in the fun. It amused her that Jake was showing interest in Ida. He sat next to her and was accommodating to her needs. To think it was Jake, who always said he would never get married. Jake, in love with a girl. Maudie smiled. After they finished eating, the girls began gathering up the scraps and putting their mess away, while the boys disappeared behind some large rocks. Soon Maudie heard them shouting and looked up just in time to see a large boulder roll down the side of the mountain. It picked up speed as it went, shearing off young trees and sending clouds of dust billowing upward. When it hit the prairie floor, it bounced once before rolling to a stop. "Come quick," said Ida as she closed the lids tightly on the pickle jars and stuffed them into the basket. "Let's go watch the boys." So the girls hurried to where the boys were prying rocks loose and letting them roll down the mountain. Then they loosened a huge one, and after much pushing and pulling, managed to get it to the edge. Just as they pushed it over the edge and it began to roll, a cow walked innocently out from beneath a ledge at the foot of the mountain. Then another followed her, and soon several more. The girls screamed, and everyone stood petrified with fear. Half-grown trees with trunks 6 to 8 inches in diameter were whacked off as the huge boulder hurtled over them. It hit other rocks and started an avalanche of smaller ones flying ever closer to the herd of cattle. While the young people watched in terror, the cows suddenly ran away, apparently hearing the rocks coming. The next instant, the largest rock crashed down on the very spot the cows had been walking only seconds earlier. A shower of smaller rocks pelted them and sent them bucking and galloping across the prairie. A great sigh of relief swept through the crowd on top of the mountain. Their eyes met, and for once, they were not laughing. What if it had been a person? Giddle spoke the thought they were all thinking. "We'd better not do that again," Harry said. "That was too close for comfort." It was a somber group that proceeded down the mountain that afternoon, and never again did they push rocks over the side. The next day was Sunday and time to have church at Jacob T.'s home. There were 6 Amish families living in New Mexico now, and the church was growing. Father insisted that as long as the weather cooperated and they continued to have good crops, more people would move in. Miles and miles of fences had been stretched and roads built. Mr. Pittman, a neighbor to the west, had opened a store and sold most of the staples they needed. Now they seldom went to Gladstone or Mills to do business. Soon New Mexico would be just as civilized as Kansas, maybe even more so. Mr. Pittman asked Father if one of his girls could work for him during the busy season leading up to Christmas. So, again, Maddie was the one to go. He made lots of taffy, peppermint patties, and other Christmas candy, and his wife helped take care of the customers. They lived in an upstairs apartment, and the store was downstairs. The day Maddie stepped inside the front door, she immediately fell in love with the store. Mrs. Pittman smiled at her from where she stood behind the counter. "Are you Maddie Borntrager?" she asked. "Yes, I am." Maddie felt awkward speaking English. "We sure are glad to see you. I've gotten so far behind with my work that I'm afraid you'll despair when you see the apartment." "Oh, no," Maddie laughed. "Just as soon as I get caught up here, I'll take you upstairs and show you around," Mrs. Pittman said. Maddie watched Mr. Pittman as he kneaded a batch of taffy. He worked on a large marble slab, pushing down hard on the ball of candy, then turning it over and pushing again. When he was satisfied that it was of the right consistency, he picked it up and threw it over a stainless steel hook on the wall. He pulled it down to the table, then threw it up over the hook again. Over and over he pulled it down and threw it back up. Soon it became smooth and white. When it was nearly finished, he picked up a small bottle with a cork pushed into its top. Uncorking it, he poured a small amount of clear liquid onto the taffy. Then he reached back to a wooden shelf and picked up another bottle of yellow food coloring. He opened the top and gently shook out 3 drops. Maddie guessed the first bottle was flavoring, probably lemon or banana, since he was coloring it yellow. She wished she could taste some. The store was filled with barrels of crackers, rice, flour, salt, sugar, and pinto beans. There were tins of leavening, cinnamon, and cocoa, but only 3 bolts of fabric were on the shelf, and Maddie didn't care for any of them. Saddles, bridles, and other tack hung along the west wall. An Indian woman was at the counter wanting to bargain a brightly colored hair ribbon for sugar. Mrs. Pittman patiently explained to her that she must pay for it with money. Maddie began growing impatient and wondered if she could find something to do if she went upstairs. She decided against it and walked outside to look around. There was a long wooden bench just outside the door, but no one sat on it. She supposed people would come and lounge there later in the day. The air smelled dry and dusty, as though a cattle train had just passed through. The Indian woman noiselessly opened the door and slipped out. Maddie watched as she walked across the prairie, not moving any part of her body except her legs and feet. Those were hidden beneath her long flowing skirt, so she appeared to glide across the ground. At long last, Mrs. Pittman led Maddie up a dark, narrow flight of stairs to their apartment. They could hear children's voices as they ascended. When they stepped into the room, the children grew quiet and shy, and Maddie felt conspicuous in her large black bonnet and shawl. She immediately removed them and laid them on a chair. Dirty dishes lay piled in the sink, but otherwise the house was orderly. The 3 children, from 3 to 7 years old, looked clean and well cared for. While Mrs. Pittman was telling her what needed to be done, Maddie decided she would be working for an efficient woman, but one that would not be hard to please. "First, you can clean the oven. Then tomorrow we'll try to get an earlier start and do the laundry." Mrs. Pittman rolled her eyes playfully and threw up her hands. She told Maddie not to be shocked at the mountain of dirty clothes and said she believed they had dirtied every stitch they owned. Maddie laughed and relaxed. She would feel right at home here, that was sure. The early snows of winter fell before Thanksgiving, and business slacked off for a few days. But when the sun returned, people came in record numbers. Soon, even Maddie helped in the store almost every day. The children played contentedly in the back of the store, sometimes helping their father wrap the little pieces of candy in shiny cellophane wrappers and laying them attractively in the glass showcase. It was an exciting time for the family, and Maddie enjoyed working for them. Mr. Pittman had a reputation for excellent candy. People came from miles around. as far away as Mills, 28 miles to the south, to purchase his sweets. One day, Mr. Pittman announced that he was running low in chocolate and Mrs. Pittman would need to go to Gladstone to get more. So the next day, she and the children went to town 12 miles away. Maudie agreed to keep the store. She had worked in it enough that she felt comfortable with the customers. The morning passed uneventfully, and Maudie swept the floors and straightened the items on the shelves. A cowboy walked in and Maudie helped him with his purchases: a bag of coffee, a small bag of sugar cubes, and some rice. Soon after he left, a young Indian boy entered the store and asked for a stumpus. "What did you say?" Maudie asked. She listened closely when he repeated it. "A stumpus." Maudie looked all around the store, trying to decide what a stumpus was. "Say it real slow," she suggested. "Stumpus," he repeated, not blinking an eye. "Stumpus?" He nodded his head. Again she looked all around the store, wondering what he could possibly mean. She didn't want to interrupt Mr. Pittman, but eventually asked him to come and see if he knew what the little boy wanted. "Can I help you with anything?" Mr. Pittman asked, bending close to hear. "I want stumpus," the boy answered seriously. "A stumpus?" Again the boy nodded. Mr. Pittman looked at Maudie and shook his head. Then he had an idea. "Is there one in this store?" he asked the little Indian. The boy nodded his head. "Can you show us?" The boy looked all around the store, then walked over to Mr. Pittman's desk. There he stood and solemnly stared at the mountain of papers. Suddenly, he reached up and took a letter from one of the pigeonholes and pointed to the stamp. "Oh, a stamp!" Maudie exclaimed. She and Mr. Pittman exchanged amused glances. Then Maudie led the boy to the counter and handed him a stamp. He gave her 2 pennies, warm from clutching them tightly in his hand. Then he turned stiffly and moved silently to the door. Not until he was out of hearing distance did she and Mr. Pittman share a good laugh over it. That afternoon, while business was slow, Maudie pulled a chair up to the window and stared at the barren landscape. A lone horse was walking with an odd gait toward the store. When he came closer, she saw he was very thin and looked half starved. The horse walked thirstily toward the water tank. When he was about 5 feet from it, he stopped and pretended to drink. Maudie wondered why he didn't move up just a little farther and get a real drink. Then suddenly realized that he was loco, crazy. He had eaten too many loco weeds and was turned out to forage for himself on the prairie. Maudie felt sorry for him and wished he would get closer to the tank and drink. After standing there for a long time and pretending to drink, he turned and in his peculiar gait walked back out to the prairie from where he had come. Life in New Mexico was harsh and taught its lessons well. Well enough that Maudie could not forget the loco horse. She knew he would probably die from his own foolishness. End of chapter 13.